The dark is rising, day 8. The hunt rides. Come, Merriman said. We must lose no more time. And the white mare wheeled them around away from the river and rose into the air, skimming the foaming water, crossing the Thames to the side that is the end of Buckshire, the beginning of Berkshire. She leapt with desperate speed, yet still Merriman urged her on. Will knew why. He had glimpsed through the flowing folds of Merriman's blue cloak. The great tornado column of the dark gathered again, even larger than before, bridging earth and sky, whirling silently in the glow of the burning ship. It was following them, and it was moving very fast. A wind came up out of the east and lashed out at them. The cloak blew forward round Will, enfolding him as if he and Merriman were shut in a great blue tent. This is the peak of it all, Merriman shouted into his ear, shouting his loudest, but still scarcely to be heard over the rising howl of the wind. You have 6 signs, but they are not yet joined. If the dark can take you now, they take all that they need to rise to power. Now they will try hardest of all. On they galloped, past houses and shops and unwitting people fighting the floods, past roofs and chimneys, over the hedges, across the fields, through the trees, never far from the ground. The great black column pursued them, rushing on the wind, and in it through it rode the black rider on his fire-dried black horse, spurring after them with lords of the dark riding at his shoulder like a spinning dark cloud themselves. The white mare rose again, and Will looked down. Trees were everywhere below them now, great single spreading oaks and beeches and open fields, and then tight-growing woods split by long straight avenues. Surely they were galloping down one such avenue now, past brooding snow-weighted fir trees and out again into open land. Lightning flashed at his left side, leaping in the depths of huge cloud, and in its light he saw the dark mass of Windsor Castle looming high and close. He thought, if that's the castle, we must be in the great park. He began to feel, too, that they were no longer alone. Twice already he had heard again that strange high yelping in the sky, but now there was more. Beings of his own kind were about here, somewhere, in the tree-thronged park. And he felt, too, that the gray-massed sky was no longer empty of life, but peopled with creatures neither of the dark nor of the light, moving to and fro and clustering and separating, holding great power. The white mare was down in the snow again, now, the hooves pounding over the drift and slush and icy paths more deliberately than before. All at once Will realized that she was not responding to Merriman, as he had thought, but following some profound impulse of her own. Lightning flickered again round them, and the sky roared. Merriman said beside his ear, "Do you know Nairn's Oak?" "Yes, of course," Will said at once. He had known the local legend all his life. "Is that where we are, the big oak tree in the great park where—" He swallowed. How could he not have thought of it? Why had Grammaire taught him everything but this? He went on slowly. "Where the Herne the hunter is supposed to ride on the eve of the 12th night?" Then he looked round fearfully at Merriman. "Herne? I go to gather the hunt," old George had said. Merriman said, "Of course, tonight the hunt rides, and because you have played your part well, tonight for the first time in more than 1,000 years the hunt will have a quarry." The white mare slowed, sniffing the air. Winds were breaking the sky apart. Half-moon sailed high through the clouds, then vanished again. Lightning danced in 6 places at once. The clouds roared and growled. The black pillar of the dark came hurtling towards them, then paused, spinning, undulating, hovering between land and sky. Merriman said, "An old way rings the great park, the way through Hunter's Combe. They will take a little while to find their path past that." Will was straining to see ahead through the murk. In the intermittent light he could make out the shape of a solitary oak tree, spreading great arms from its short, tremendous trunk. Unlike most other trees in sight, it bore not the small remnant of snow, and a shadow stood beside its trunk, the size of a man. The white mare saw the shadow at the same time. She blew hard through her nose and pawed the ground. Will said to himself very softly, "The white horse must go to the hunter." Merriman touched him on the shoulder, and with swift, enchanted ease they slid down to the ground. The mare bent her head to them, and Will laid his hand on the tough, smooth, white neck. "Go, my friend," Merriman said, and the horse swung about, trotted eagerly towards the huge, solitary oak tree and the mysterious shadow motionless beneath. The creature who owned that shadow was of immense power. Will flinched before the sense of it. And the moon went behind the clouds again. For a while there was no lightning. In the gloom they could see nothing move beneath the tree. One sound came through the darkness, a whinny of greeting from the white mare. As if in counterpoint, a deeper snuffling whinny came out of the trees beside them as Will swung round. The moon sailed clear of the cloud again, and he saw the huge silhouette of Pollux, the Shire horse from Dawson's farm, with old George high on his back. "Your sister is at home, boy," old George said. "She got lost, you know, and fell asleep in an old barn, and had such a curious dream that she is already forgetting." Will nodded gratefully and smiled, but he was gazing at the curious round shape muffled by wrapping that George held before him. "What's that?" His neck was tingling even from being close to it, whatever it was. Old George did not answer. He went down to Merriman. "Is all well?" "All goes well," Merriman said. He shivered and drew his long cloak round him. "Give it to the boy." He looked hard at Will out of his inscrutable deepest eyes, and Will, wondering, went towards the cart horse and stood at George's knee, looking up. With a quick, mirthless grin that seemed to mask great strain, the old man lowered the shadowed burden towards him. It was half as large as Will himself, though not as heavy. It was wrapped in sacking, and as he laid hands on it, Will knew instantly what it was. It can't be, he thought incredulously. What would be the point? Thunder rumbled again all around. Merriman's voice said, deep in the shadows behind him, but of course it is. The water brought it in safety. Then the old ones took it from the water at proper time. And now, old George said from his place on high on patient pollux, you must take it to the hunter, young old one. Young Will swallowed nervously. An old one had nothing in the world to fear, nothing. Yet there had been something so strange and awesome about that shadowy figure beneath the giant oak, something that made one feel unnecessary, insignificant, small. He straightened. Unnecessary was the wrong word, at any rate. He had a task to perform, raising his burden like a standard. He pulled away its covering, and the bright, eerie carnival head that was half man, half beast, emerged as smooth and gay as if it had just arrived from its distant island. The antlers stood up proudly. He saw that they were exactly the shape of those on the golden stag, the figurehead to the dead king's ship. Holding the mast before him, he walked firmly towards the deep shadow of the broad spreading oak. At its edge he paused. He could see glimmer of white from the mare moving gently in recognition. He could see that the mare had a rider, but that was all. The figure on the horse bent down towards him. He did not see the face, but only felt the mask lifted from his hands, and his hands fell back as if they had been relieved of a great weight. Even though the head had from the beginning seemed so light, he backed away. The moon came sailing suddenly from behind a cloud, and for a moment his eyes dazzled as he looked full into its cold white light. Then it was gone again, and the white horse was moving out of the shadow with the figure on its back, changed in outline against the dim-lit sky. The rider had a head now that was bigger than the head of a man and horned with antlers of a stag, and the white mare bearing this monstrous stag man was moving inexorably towards Will. He stood, waiting until the great horse came close. Its nose gently touched his shoulder once for the last time. The figure of the hunter towered over him. The moonlight now glimmered clear on his head, and Will found himself gazing up into strange tawny eyes, yellow gold, unfathomable, like the eyes of some huge bird. He gazed into the hunter's eyes, and he heard in the sky that strange, high yelping begin again. With the difficulty of escaping an enchantment, he dragged his gaze aside to look properly at the head, the great horned mask that he had given the hunter to put on. But the head was real. The golden eyes blinked. Feather-fringed and round, with the deliberate blink of an owl's strong eyelids, the man's face in which they were set was turned full on Will, and the firm, carved mouth above the soft beard parted in a quick smile. The mouth troubled Will. It was not the mouth of an old one. It could smile in friendship, but there were other lines round it as well. Where Merriman's face was marked with lines of sadness and anger, the hunter's told instead of cruelty and pitiless impulse to revenge. Indeed, he was half beast. The dark branches of Hearn's antlers curved up over Will, the moonlight glinting on their velvety sheen, and the hunter laughed softly. He looked down at Will out of his yellow eyes in the face that was no longer a mask, but living, and he spoke in a voice like a tenor bell. "The signs, old one," he said. "Show me the signs." Without taking his eyes from the towering figure, Will fumbled with his buckle and held the six-quartered circles high in the moonlight. The hunter looked at them and bent his head. When he raised it again slowly, the soft voice was half singing, half chanting words that Will had heard before. "When the dark comes rising, 6 shall turn it back. 3 from the circle, 3 from the track. Wood, bronze, iron, water, fire, stone. 5 will return, and 1 go alone. Iron for the birthday, bronze carried long. Wood from the burning, stone out of song. Fire in the candle ring, water from the thaw. 6 signs of circle, and the grail gone before." He did, too, not end where Will expected him to. He went on. "Fire on the mountain shall find the harp of gold, played to wake the sleepers, oldest of the old. Power from the green witch, lost beneath the sea. All shall find the light at last, silver on the tree." The yellow eyes looked at Will again, but they did not see him now. They had grown cold, abstracted, a chill fire mounting in them that brought the cruel lines back to the face. But Will saw the cruelty now as the fierce inevitability of nature. It was not from malice that the light and the servants of the light would ever hound the dark, but from the nature of things. Hearn the hunter wheeled round on the great white horse away from Will and the single oak tree until his fearsome silhouette was in the open, under the moon and the still lowering storm clouds. He raised his head and he made to the sky a call that was like a hallow blown at a huntsman on the horn to call up the hounds. The hunting horn of his voice seemed to grow and grow and to fill the sky and come from 1,000 throats at once. And Will saw that this did, for from every point of the park, behind every shadow or tree, out of every cloud, leaping from the ground and through the air, came an endless pack of hounds, sounding, belling, as hunting dogs do when they are starting after a scent. They were huge white animals, ghostly in half-light, loping and jostling and bounding together. They paid not the least attention to the old ones or to anything but Hearn on his white horse. Their ears were red, their eyes were red, they were ugly creatures. Will drew back involuntarily as they passed. One great silvery dog broke stride to glance at him. with as casual a curiosity as if he had been a fallen branch. The red eyes and the white head were like flames, and the red ears stood taut upright with dreadful eagerness, so that Will tried not to imagine what it would be like to be hunted by such dogs. Round Ern and the white mare they bayed and bellowed in a heavy, heaving sea of red-flecked foam. Then all at once the antlered man stiffened, his great horns pointing as a hunting dog points, and he called the hounds together with a rapid, urgent, collecting call, the menae that sends a pack after blood. A bedlam of yelping urgency rose from the milling white dogs, filling the sky, and at the same moment the full strength of the thunderstorm erupted. Clouds split, roaring into bright, jagged lightning, as Herne and the white horse leapt exultingly up into the arena of the sky, with the red-eyed hounds pouring up into the stormy air after them in a great white flood. But then a sudden, terrible silence, like suffocation, came, blotting out all sound of the storm. In the moment of its last desperate chance, breaking across the barrier that had been holding it at bay, the dark came for Will. Shutting out the sky and the earth, and the deadly spinning pillar came at him, dreadful in its furious, whirling energy and utter quiet. There was no time for fear. Will stood alone, and the towering black column rushed to engulf him, with all the monstrous forces of the dark arrayed in its writhing mist. And its center, the great foam-mouthed black stallion reared up with the black rider, his eyes two brilliant points of blue fire. Will called vainly on every spell of the defense at his command, yet knew that his hands were powerless to move the signs for help. He stood where he was, despairing, and closed his eyes. But into the dead world muffling silence and wrapping him, one small sound came. It was the same strange high whickering far up in the sky, like the passing of many migrant geese on an autumn night, and he had heard 3 times that day. Nearer, louder it grew. Opening his eyes, and he saw a scene like nothing he had ever seen before, nor ever saw again. Half the sky was thick and dreadful with the silent raging of the dark, and its whirling tornado power. But now running towards it, out of the west with the speed of dropping stones, came Herne and the wild hunt. At the peak of their power now, in full cry, they came roaring out of the great dark thundercloud through streaking lightning and gray-purple clouds, riding on the storm. The yellow-eyed antlered man rode laughing dreadfully, crying out at their avant that rallies of hounds on the full chase, and his brilliant white-gold horse flung forward with mane and tail flying. All around them and endlessly behind them, like a broad white river, poured the yell hounds, the yelpers, the hounds of doom, the red eyes burning with 1,000 warning flames. The sky was white with them. They filled the western horizon, and still they came unending. At the sound of their bell-like, thousand-tongued yelping, the magnificence of the dark flinched and swayed and seemed to tremble. Will caught sight of the black rider once more, high in the dark mist. His face was twisted in fury and dread and frozen malevolence, and behind these the awareness of defeat. He spun his horse so fiercely round that the lithe black stallion tottered and almost fell. As he jerked at the rein, the rider seemed to cast something impatiently from his saddle, a small dark object that fell limp and loose to the ground, and lay there like a discarded cloak. Then the storm and the rushing wild hunt were upon the rider. He rode up into his whirling black refuge. The fantastic tornado pillar of the dark curved and twisted, lashed like a snake in agony, until finally there was a great shriek in the heavens, and it began rushing at furious speed northward. Over the park and the common and the hunter's comb it fled, and after it went Herne and the hunt in full cry, a long white crest on the surge of the storm. The yelping of the hounds died with distance, fading last of all the sounds of the chase, and above Ern's oak the silver half-moon was left floating in a sky flecked with small, ragged remnants of cloud. Will drew a long breath and looked round. Merriman stood exactly as he had seen him, tall and straight, hooded, a dark, featureless statue. Old George had drawn Pollux back into the trees, for no normal animal could have faced the hunt so close and survived. Will said, "Is it over?" "More or less," Merriman said, faceless under the hood. "The dark is," he dared not bring out the words, "the dark is vanquished at last in its encounter. Nothing may outface the wild hunt. And Ern and his hounds hunt their quarry as far as they may, to the very ends of the earth. So at the ends of the earth the lords of the dark must skulk now, awaiting their next time of chance. But for the next time we are this much stronger, by the completed circle and the 6 signs and the gift of Grimaire. We are made stronger by your completed quest, Will Stanton, and closer to gaining the last victory, at the very end." He pushed back his broad hood, the wild white hair glinting in the moonlight, and for a moment the shadowed eyes looked into Will's with a communication of pride that made Will's face warm with pleasure. Then Merriman looked out across the dappled, snow-mounted grassland of the great park. "There is left only the joining of the signs," he said, "but before that one small thing." A curious jerkiness caught at his voice. Will followed, puzzled, as he strode forward close to Hern's oak. Then he saw on the snow, at the edge of the tree's shadow, the crumpled cloak that the black rider had let fall as he turned to flee. Merriman stooped, then knelt down beside it, in the snow. Still wondering, Will peered closer and saw with a shock that the dark heap was not a cloak, but a man. The figure lay face upward, twisted at a terrible angle. It was the walker. It was Hakon. Merriman said, his voice deep and expressionless. Those who ride high with the Lord of the Dark must expect to fall, and men do not fall easily from such heights. I think his back is broken. It occurred to Will, looking at the small, still face, that this time he had forgotten that Hakon was no more than an ordinary man. Not ordinary, perhaps. That was not the word for a man who had been used by both light and dark, and sent many ways through time to become at last the walker, battered by wandering through 600 years, but a man nonetheless immortal. The white face flickered, and the eyes opened. Pain came into them, in the shadow of a different, remembered pain. He threw me down, Hakon said. Merriman looked at him, but said nothing. Yes, Hakon whispered bitterly. You knew it would happen. He gasped with pain as he tried to move his head, then panic came into his eyes. Only my head. I feel my head because of the pain, but my arms, my legs, they are not there. There was a dreadful, desolate hopelessness in the lined face now. Hakon looked full at Merriman. I am lost, he said. I know it. Will you make me live on, with the worst of suffering of all now come? The last right of a man is to die. You prevented it all this time. You made me live on through the centuries when I often longed for death, and for a betrayal that I fell into because I had not the wit of an old one. The grief and longing in his voice were intolerable. Will turned his head away, but Merriman said, You were Hakon, my foster son and liege man, who betrayed your lord in the light. So you became the walker, to walk the earth for as long as the light required it. And so you lived on indeed, but we have not kept you since then, my friend. Once the walker's task was done, you were free, and you could have had rest forever. Instead, you chose to listen to the promises of the dark and to betray the light a second time. I gave you the freedom to choose, Hakon, and I did not take it away. I may not. It is still yours. No power of the dark or the light can make a man more than a man once any supernatural role he may have had to play comes to an end. But no power of the dark or the light may take away his rights as a man either. If the Black Rider told you so, he lied. The twisted face gazed up at him in agonized near belief. I may have rest. There can be an end and rest if I choose. All your choices have been your own, said Merriman sadly. Hakon nodded his head. A spasm of pain flashed across his face and was gone. But the eyes that looked up at them then were the bright, lively eyes at the beginning of the small, neat man in the green velvet coat. They turned to Will. Hakon said softly, Use the gift well, old one. Then he looked back at Merriman, a long, unfathomable private look, and he said almost inaudibly, Master. Then the light went out behind the bright eyes, and there was no longer anyone there. The joining of the signs. In the low-roofed smithy, Will stood with his back to the entrance, staring into the fire. Orange and red and fierce and yellow-white it burned as John Smith pushed at the long below arm. The warmth made Will feel comfortable for the first time that day. There was no great harm in an old one being fish-wet in an icy river, but he was glad to feel the warmth in his bones again, and the fire lit his spirits as it lit the whole room. Yet it did not properly light the room, for nothing that Will could see appeared solid. There was a quivering in the air. Only the fire seemed real. The rest might have been a mirage. He saw Merriman watching him with a half-smile. It's that half-world feeling again, Will said, baffled. The same as that day in the manor when we were in two kinds of time at once. It is, just the same, and so we are. Or we're in the time of the smithy, Will said. We went through the doors. So they had, he and Merriman, old George, and the huge horse Pollux, out on the wet, dark common. When the wild hunt had driven the dark away over the sky, they had gone through the doors into the time 6 centuries earlier from which Hakon had once come, and into which Will had walked on the still, snowy morning of his birthday. They had brought Hakon back to his century for the last time, borne on Pollux's broad back, when they were all come through the doors. Old George had taken the horse away, bearing Hakon's body in the direction of the church, and Will knew that in his own time, somewhere in the village churchyard, covered either by more recent burials or by a stone crumbling into illegibility, now there would be the grave of a man named Hakon, who died some time in the 13th century and lain there in peace ever since. Merriman drew him to the front of the smithy, where it faced the narrow, hard earth track through Hunter's Combe, the old way. Listen, he said. Will looked at the bumpy track, the dense trees on the other side, the cold gray strip of almost morning sky. I can hear the river, he said, puzzled. Ah, Merriman said. But the river's miles away, the other side of Common. Merriman cocked his head to the rushing, rippling sound of water. It had the sound of a river that is full, but not in a flood, a river running much after much rain. What we are hearing, he said, is not the Thames, but the sound of the 20th century. You see, Will, the signs must be joined by John Wayland Smith in this smithy, in this time, for not long after this the smithy was destroyed. Yet the signs were not brought together until your quest, which has been within your own time. So the joining must be done in a bubble of time between the two, from which the eyes and the ears of an old one may perceive both. That's not a real river we hear. It is the water running in your time down Huntercombe Lane from the melting of the snow. Will thought of the snow and of his family beset by floods, and suddenly he was a small boy wanting very much to be at home. Merriman's dark eyes looked at him compassionately. Not long, he said. A hammering sound came from behind them. They turned. John Smith had finished pumping the bellows at his red-white fire. He was working at the anvil instead, while the long tongs waited ready before the fire's glow. He was not using his usual heavy hammer, but another that looked ridiculously small in his broad fist. A delicate tool, more like those Will saw his father use for jewelry, but then the object on which he was working was far more delicate than horseshoes, a golden chain, broad link from which the 6 signs would hang. The links lay in a row beside John's hand. He looked up, his face flushed red by the fire. I am almost ready. Very well, then. Merriman left them and stalked out to the road. He stood there alone, tall and imposing in the long blue coat, the hood pushed back so that his thick white hair glinted like snow. But there was no snow here, and even through the sound of the water that Will could still hear rushing. No water either. Then the change began. Merriman seemed not to have moved. He stood there with his back to them, his hands loose at his sides, very still without the least movement. But all around him the world was beginning to move. The air shivered and quaked, and the outlines of trees and earth and sky trembled, blurred, and all things visible seemed to swim and intermingle. Will stood looking at this wavering world, feeling a little giddy, and gradually he began to hear over the sound of the unseen, rushing river road the murmur of many voices, like a place seen through a shimmering haze of heat. The trembling world began to resolve itself into outlines of visible things, and he saw that a great indistinct throng of people filled the road and the spaces between all the trees and all the open yard before the smithy. They seemed not quite real, not quite firm. They had a ghostly quality, as if they might disappear when touched. They smiled at Merriman, greeting him where he stood, his face turned away still from Will. Thronging round him, they gazed eagerly ahead at the smithy like an audience about to watch a play, but as yet none of them seemed to see Will and the smith. There was an endless variety of faces, gay, somber, old, young, paper white, jet black, and every shade and gradation of pink and brown between, vaguely recognizable or totally strange. Will thought he recognized faces from the party at Miss Graythorne's Manor, the party in the 19th century Christmas that had led Hawken to disaster and himself to the Book of Brumaire, and then he knew. All these people, this endless throng that Merriman had somehow summoned, were the old ones. From every land, from every part of the world, here they were, to witness the joining of the signs. Will was all at once terrified, longing to sink into the ground and escape the gaze of this great, new, enchanted world. He thought, these are my people. This is my family in the same way as my real family, the old ones. Every one of us is linked for the greatest purpose in the world. Then he saw a stir in the crowd, running like a ripple along the road, and some began to shift and move as if to make way. And he heard the music, the piping, thrumming sound, almost comical in its simplicity, of the fifes and drums, and he heard in his dream that might not have been a dream. He stood stiffly with his hands clenched, waiting, and Merriman swung round and strode to the stand beside him. As out of the crowd towards them came the little procession just as it had been before. Through the thronging figures, and curiously seeming more solid than any, came the little procession of boys, the same boys in their rough, unfamiliar tunics and leggings, shoulder-length hair, and strange bunched caps. Again those at the front carried sticks and bundles of birch twigs, while those at the backs played their single, repeated melancholy tune on pipes and drums. Again between those two groups came 6 boys carrying on their shoulders a bier woven of branches and reeds with a bunch of holly at each corner. Merriman said very softly, first on St. Stephen's Day, the day after Christmas, then on 12th night, twice in the year, if it is a particular year, comes the hunting of the wren. But now Will could see the briar plainly, and even at the beginning this time there was no wren. Instead, that other delicate form lay there, the old lady, robed in blue, with a great rose-colored ring on one hand, and the boys marched up to the smithy and very gently laid their bier down on the ground. Merriman bent over it, holding out his hand, and the lady opened her eyes and smiled. He helped her to her feet, moving forward towards Will. She took both his hands in hers. Well done, Will Stanton, she said, and through all the crowd of the old ones thronging the track, a murmur of approval went up like the wind singing in the trees. The lady turned to face the smithy where John stood waiting. She said, on oak and on iron let the signs be joined. Come, Will, said John Smith. Together they moved to the anvil. Will laid down the belt that had borne the signs through all their seeking. And on oak and on iron, he whispered. Iron for the anvil, said the smith softly. Oak for its foot. The The big wooden base of the anvil is always oak, the root of an oak, strongest part of the tree. Have I not heard someone telling you the nature of wood a while ago?" His blue eyes twinkled at Will, and then he turned to his work. One by one he took the signs and joined them with the rings of gold. In the center he set the signs of fire and water. On one side of them the signs of iron and bronze, and on the other side the signs of wood and stone. At each end he fastened a length of sturdy gold chain. He worked swiftly and delicately while Will gazed. Outside, the great crowds of the old ones was still as growing grass. Beside the tapping of the smith's hammer and the occasional hiss of the bellows, there was no sound anywhere but the running water of the invisible river road, centuries away in the future, and yet close at hand. "It is done," said John at last. Ceremonially he handed Will the glittering chain of linked signs, and Will gasped at the beauty of them. Holding the signs now, he felt from them suddenly a strange, fierce sensation like an electric shock, a strong, arrogant reassurance of power. Will was puzzled. Danger was past. The dark was fled. What purpose had this? He walked to the lady, still wondering, put the signs into her hands, and knelt down before her. She said, "But it's for the future, Will, don't you see? That is what the signs are for. They are the second of the four things of power. They have slept these many centuries, and they are a great part of our strength. Each of the things of power was made at a different point in time by different craftsmen of the light to await the day when it would be needed. There is a golden chalice, called a grail. There is the circle of signs. There is a sword of crystal and a harp of gold. The grail, like the signs, is safely found. The other two we must yet achieve, other quests for other times. But once we have added those to these, then when the dark comes rising for its final and most dreadful attempt on the world, we shall have hope and assurance that we can overcome." She raised her head, looking out over the unnumbered, ghostly crowd of the old ones. "When the dark comes rising," she said, expressionless, and the many voices answered her in a soft, ominous rumble. "Six shall drive it back." Then she looked down at Will, again at Will, the lines around her ageless eyes creasing in affection. "Sign seeker," she said, "by your birth and by your birthday you came into your own, and the circle of the old ones was complete, for now and forever. And by your good use of the gift of Grimaire, you achieved a great quest and proved yourself stronger than the testing. Until we meet again, as we meet we shall, we remember you with pride." The far-stretching crowd murmured again a different, warm response, and with her thin, small hands, the great rose ring glimmering, the lady bent down and set the chain of the linked signs round Will's neck. Then she kissed him lightly on the forehead, the gentle brushing by of a bird's wing. "Farewell, Will Stanton," she said. The murmur of voices rose, and the world spun round Will in a flurry of trees and flame. Rising over it all was the bell-like haunting phrase of his music, louder and more joyful now than before. It chimed and rang in his head, filling him with such delight. Then he closed his eyes and floated in its beauty. It was, he knew for a crack of a second, the spirit and essence of the light, this music, but then it began gradually to fade, to grow distant and beckoning in a little melancholy as it always had before, fading into nothing, fading, with the sound of running water rising to take its place. Will cried out in sorrow and opened his eyes. And he was kneeling on the cold, beaten snow in the gray, dead light of early morning in a place he did not recognize beside Huntercombe Lane. Bare trees rose out of pitted, wet snow on the other side of the road. Through the lane itself was once more a clear paved road. Water ran fiercely in each of its gutters with a sound like a stream, or even a river. The road was empty. No one was anywhere to be seen among the trees. Will could have wept with the sense of loss. All that warm crowd of friends, the brightness and light and celebration, and the lady, all gone, all fled, leaving him alone. He put his hand to his neck. The signs were still there. Behind him, Merriman's deep voice said, "Time to go home, Will." "Oh," Will said unhappily, without turning around. "I'm glad you're still there." "You sound most glad," Merriman said dryly. "Restrain your ecstasy, I pray you." Sitting back on his heels, Will looked at him over his shoulder. Merriman gazed down at him with immense solemnity, with his dark eyes owlish, and suddenly the emotions that were drawn into a tight, unbearable knot inside Will cracked and broke, and he dissolved into laughter. Merriman's mouth twitched slightly. He put out his hand, and Will scrambled to his feet, still sputtering. "It was just," Will said, and stopped, not quite sure yet whether he was laughing or crying. "It was an alteration, Merriman said gently. "Can you walk now?" "Of course I can walk," said Will indignantly. He stared about him. Where the smithy had been, there was a battered brick building like a garage, and around it he could see traces of cold frames and vegetable beds through the melting snow. He looked quickly up and saw the outline of a familiar house. "It's the manor," he said. "The back entrance," Merriman said, "near the village, used mainly by tradesmen and butlers." He smiled at Will. "This is really where the old smithy used to be?" In the plans of the old house, it is called Smith's Gate, Merriman said. Buckinghamshire historians writing about Huntercombe are very fond of speculating on the reason. They are always wrong. Will stared through the trees at the manor's tall, Tudor chimneys and gabled roofs. Is Miss Graythorne there? Yes, she is now. But didn't you see her in the crowd? The crowd? Will became aware that his mouth was foolishly gaping and shut it. Conflicting images chased one another through his head. You mean she is one of the old ones? Merriman raised an eyebrow. Come now, Will. Your senses told you that long ago. Well, yes, they did, but I never knew quite which Miss Graythorne it was who belonged to us, the one from today or from the Christmas party. Well, yes, I suppose I knew that too. He looked up tentatively at Merriman. They are the same, aren't they? That's better, Merriman said. Miss Graythorne gave me, while you and Wayland Smith were intent on your work, 2 guests for the 12th night. One is for your brother Paul, and one is for you. He showed Will 2 shapeless, small packages wrapped in what looked like silk, then drew them again under his cloak. Paul's is a normal present, I think, more or less. Yours is something to be used only in the future, at some point when your judgment tells you you may need it. 12th night, Will said. Is that tonight? He looked up at the gray early morning sky. Merriman, how have you stopped my family wondering where I've been? Is my mother truly all right? Of course she is, Merriman said, and you have spent the night at the manor, asleep. Come now, these are small things. I know all the questions. You will have all the answers and when you are once at home, and in any case, really, you know them already. He turned his head down towards Will, and the deep dark eyes stared compelling as a basilisk. Come, old one, he said softly, remember yourself. You are no longer a small boy. No, said Will. I know. Merriman said, but sometimes you feel how very much more agreeable life would be if you were. Sometimes, Will said. He grinned, but not always. They turned and strode over the little edge stream of the road to walk together towards the Stantons' house along Huntercomb's Lane. The day grew brighter, and light began to infuse the edge of the sky before them, where the sun would soon come up. A thin mist hung over the snow on both sides of the road, wreathing round the bare trees and little streams. It was a morning full of promise, with a hazy, cloudless sky tinged faintly with blue, the kind of sky that Huntercombe had not seen for many days. And they walked as old friends walk, without often speaking, sharing the kind of silence that is not so much silence as a kind of still communication. Their footsteps rang out on the bare, wet road, making the only sound anywhere in the village except the song of a blackbird and, somewhere further off, the sound of someone shoveling. Trees loomed black and leafless over the road on one side, and Will saw that they were at the corner that passed Rook's Wood. He stared upwards. Not a sound came out of the trees, or the untidy great nests high up there in the misted branches. The rooks are very quiet, he said. Merriman said, they are not there. Not there? Why not? Where are they? Merriman smiled, the small grim smile. When the yellow hounds are hunting across the sky, no animal or bird may stay within sight of them, and not be driven wild by terror. All through this kingdom, along the path of Ern and the hunt, masters will not be able to find any creature that was loose that night. It was better known in the older days. Countrymen everywhere used to lock up their animals on the 12th night eve, in case the hunt should ride. But what happens? Are they killed? Will found that, in spite of all the rooks had done for the dark, he did not want to think of them all destroyed. Oh no, Merriman said, scattered, driven willy-nilly across the sky for as long as the nearest hound chooses to drive them. The hounds of doom are not of the species that kills living creatures or eats flesh. The rooks will come back eventually, one by one, bedraggled, weary, sorry for themselves. Wiser birds who had no dealings with the dark would have hidden themselves away last night, beneath branches or house eaves, out of sight. Those who did are still here, unharmed. But it will take a while for our friends the rooks to recover themselves. I think you will have no trouble with them again, Will, though I would never quite trust one if I were you. Look, Will said, pointing ahead. There are 2 to trust. Pride came thick into his voice as down the road towards them came rushing and bounding the 2 Stanton dogs, Rack and Sigh. They leapt at him, barking and whining with delight, licking his hands in a greeting as gigantic as if he had been gone for a month. Will stopped to speak to them, and was enveloped in waving tails and warm, panting heads and large, wet feet. Get off, you idiots, he said happily. Merriman said very softly, gently now. Instantly the dogs calmed and were still, only their tails enthusiastically waving. Both turned to Merriman and looked up at him for a moment, and then they were trotting amiably in silence at Will's side. Then the Stanton driveway was ahead, and the noise of shovels grew loud, and around the corner they found Paul and Mr. Stanton rapping against the cold, clearing wet snow and leaves and twigs away from the drain. Well, well, said Mr. Stanton, and stood leaning on his shovel. "Hello, Dad," said Will cheerfully, and ran and hugged him. Merriman said, "Good morning." "Old George said you'd be about early," said Mr. Stanton, "but I didn't think he meant quite this early. However did you manage to wake him up?" "I woke up myself," Will said. "Yeah, I turned over a new leaf for the new year. What are you doing?" "Turning over new leaves," Paul said. "Ho, ho, ho. We are, though. The thaw came so suddenly that the ground was still frozen and nothing could drain away. And now that the drains are beginning to thaw as well, the floods got everything jammed up with washed-away rubbish. Like this." He lifted a dripping bundle. Will said, "I'll get another spade and help." "Wouldn't you like some breakfast first?" Paul said. "Mary's getting us some, believe it or not. There's a lot of leaf-turning going on here, while the year's still new." Will suddenly realized that it was a long time since he had last eaten, and felt a gigantic hunger. He said. "Come on in and have some breakfast or a cup of tea or something," said Mr. Stanton to Merriman. "It's a chilly walk from the manor this time in the morning. I really am extremely grateful to you for delivering him, not to mention looking after him last night." Merriman shook his head, smiling, and pulled up the collar of what Will had now again suddenly changed from a cloak to a heavy 20th century overcoat. "Thank you, but I'll be getting back." "Will," a voice shrilled, and Mary came flying up the drive. Will went to meet her, and she skidded into him and punched him in the stomach. "Was it fun at the manor? Did you sleep in a four-poster?" "Not exactly," Will said. "Are you all right?" "Well, of course, I had a super ride on old George's horse. It was one of Mr. Dawson's huge ones, the show horses. He picked me up in the lane quite soon after I'd gone out. Seems ages ago, not last night." She looked at Will rather sheepishly. "I suppose I shouldn't have gone out after Max like that, but everything was happening so quickly, and I was worried about Mom not having help. Is she really all right?" "She'll be fine, the doctor says. It was a sprain, not a broken leg. She did knock herself out, though, so she has to rest for a week or two. She's as cheerful as can be. You'll see." Will looked up the drive. Paul, Merriman, and his father were talking and laughing together. He thought perhaps his father had decided that Lion the butler was a good chap after all, not merely a manorial prop. Mary said, "Sorry about you getting lost in the wood. It was all my fault. You and Paul must have been very close behind me, actually. Good job old George ended up knowing where everyone was. Poor Paul, worrying about both of us being lost instead of just me." She giggled and tried to look penitent without great effort. "Will," Paul swung away from the group, excited, running towards them. "Just look, Miss Graythorne calls it a permanent loan. Bless her, look." His face was flushed with pleasure. He held out the bundle Merriman had been carrying, now open, and Will saw lying on it the old flute from the manor. Feeling his face break into a long, small smile, he looked up at Merriman. The dark eyes looked down at him gravely, and Merriman held out the second package. "This the lady of the manor sent for you." Will opened it. Inside lay a small hunting horn, gleaming, thin with age. His gaze flicked more briefly to Merriman and down again. Mary hopped about, giggling. "Go on, Will, blow it. You could make a noise all the way to Windsor. Go on." Later, Will said, "I have to learn now. Will, thank you. Thank her for me very much," he said to Merriman. Merriman inclined his head. "Now I must go," he said. Roger Stanton said, "I can't tell you how grateful we've been for all your help with everything through this mad weather and the children. You really have been most tremendously—" He lost his words, but thrust out his arm and pumped Merriman's hand up and down with such warmth that Will thought he would never stop. The craggy, fierce-carved face softened. Merriman looked pleased and a little surprised. He smiled and nodded, but said nothing. Paul shook hands with him and Mary. Then Will's hand was in strong grasp, and there was a quick pressure and a brief, intent look from the deep, dark eyes. Merriman said, "Au revoir, Will." He raised his hand to them all and strode off down the lane. Will drifted after him. Will said, skipping at his side, "Did you hear the wild geese last night?" "Geese," Will said gruffly. He was not really listening. "Geese, and all that storm?" "What storm?" said Mary, and went on before he could blink. "Wild geese. There must have been thousands of them migrating, I suppose. We didn't see them. There was just this gorgeous noise. First of all, a lot of crackling from those draft rooks in the woods, and then a long sort of yelping noise across the sky, very high up. It was thrilling." "Yes," said Will. "Yes, it must have been." "I don't think you're more than half awake," Mary said in disgust, and she went hopping ahead to the end of the driveway. Then she stopped suddenly and stood very still. "My goodness, Will, look!" She was peering at something behind a tree, hidden by the remnants of a snowbank. Will came to look and saw, lying among the wet undergrowth, the great carnival head, with the eyes of an owl, the face of a man, the antlers of a deer. He stared and stared without a word in his throat. The head was crisp and bright and dry, as it had always been, and always would be. It looked like the outline of Herne, the hunter, that he had seen against the sky, and yet not alike. Still he stared and said nothing. "Well, I never," said Mary brightly. "Aren't you lucky it got stuck there? Mom will be pleased." She was awake by then, It was when the floods came up all of a sudden. You weren't there, of course. The water came in all over the ground floor, and quite a lot of things got washed out of the living room before we realized. That head was one of them. Mom was all upset because she knew you'd be. Well, look at that. Fancy that. She peered closer at the head, still prattling gaily, but Will was no longer listening. The head lay very close to the garden wall, which was still buried in snow, but beginning to break through the drifts at either side. And on the drift at the outer edge, covering the verge of the road and overhanging the running stream in the gutter, there were a number of marks. They were hoof prints, made by a horse stopping and pivoting and leaping away over the snow, but none of them was in the shape of a horseshoe. They were circles quartered by a cross, the prints of the shoes that John Wayland Smith, once at the beginning, had put on the white mare of the light. Will looked at the prints and at the carnival head and swallowed hard. He walked a few paces to the end of the driveway and looked down Huntercombe Lane. He could see Merriman's back still as the tall, dark-clad figure strode away, and then his hair prickled and his pulses stood still, for behind him came a sound sweeter than seemed possible in the raw air of the cold gray morning. It was the soft, beautiful, yearning tone of the old flute from the manor. Paul, irresistibly drawn, must have put the instrument together to try it out. He was playing Greensleeves once more, the eerie, enchanted lilt floating out through the morning on the still air, while Will saw Merriman raise his wild, white head as he heard it, though he did not break his stride. As he looked down the road still, with the music singing in his ears, Will saw that out beyond Merriman the trees and the mist and the stretch of the road were shaking, shivering in a way that he knew well, and then gradually out there he saw the great doors take shape. There they stood, as he had seen them on the open hillside and in the manor, the tall carved doors that led out of time, standing alone and upright in the old way that was known now as Huntercombe Lane. Very slowly they began to open. Somewhere behind Will the music of Greensleeves broke off, with a laugh and some muffled words from Paul, but there was no break in the music that was in Will's head, for now it had changed into that haunting, bell-like phrase that came always with the opening of the doors or any great change that might alter the lives of the old ones. Will clenched his fists as he listened, yearning towards the sweet, beckoning sound that was the space between waking and dreaming, yesterday and tomorrow, memory and imagining. It floated lovingly in his mind, then gradually grew distant, fading, as out on the old way Merriman's tall figure swirled round again, now by a blue cloak, passed through the open doors. Behind him the towering slabs of a heavy carved oak swung slowly together, until silently they shut. Then, as the last echo of the enchanted music died, they disappeared, and in a great blaze of yellow-white light, the sun rose over Hunter's Combe in the Valley of the Thames. Here ends The Dark is Rising. The next book in the Dark is Rising sequence is Greenwich.